Camping is supposed to be the kind of escape that reminds you how small we are. Tonight's 5 stories are different. They're about nights when the woods didn't just remind people of their size. They watched. These are true-style accounts from people who thought they were alone. Don't listen alone. We joked about the map pin being too perfect. There was a thin ribbon of a road, a near-empty parking pole, and a place labeled simply Lake Access on the campsite app. My friend Lyle found it on a Sunday when the rest of us wanted a cheap getaway and nothing more. The idea was 3 days of paddling, a cooler full of terrible beer, and a portable speaker loud enough to embarrass the wildlife. We were 6 of us in our late 20s. 2 couples and me, the one who volunteered to be the guy who cooks. We pulled into the loop mid-afternoon, claimed the last site with water access, and set the tent near a stand of birch. The lake sat like a flat black mirror. The rules at the sign said, "Quiet after 10 p.m., but that's a rule you treat as polite suggestion on weekends. The first night was forgettable in the way good things are: fire, deep coffee, mediocre marshmallows. About midnight, the fire board softened into embers and everyone trickled into the tent except for me and Lyle, who wanted just one more and a few extra cigarettes. That's when I heard footsteps on the gravel path that runs the circumference of the site. Not the deal-with-it crunch of raccoons or the weird rustle of deer. These were steps with weight and intention. Heel-toe, heel-slow. They moved along the path opposite our campsite for a while and then paused near our neighbor's dark tent. We both stood and watched the silhouette of the trees. Lal joked, "Probably some drunk tourist," and tapped the pack. I thought at the time he was right. I thought it would be fine. I thought a lot of things that night that I wish I hadn't. We finally put out the fire and zipped the tent. The warm night cool enough that the condensation whispered on the tarp. The speaker was under the duffel. The tent zipper clicked. Around 2:03 a.m., I woke up to a faint thump against the tent wall. Not a big one, not a frantic one, just 3 measured taps, too slow, one soft that made my teeth ache with the memory of a knock. I lay still. The thud came again, 2 taps, 1 tap, the kind of rhythm you use for testing a door. I fumbled for the flashlight and peered through the tent vestibule. A pale circle of light from a distant lamp painted the path. The shadows were dense as ink. There was nothing visible. The tent silk held the shape of a hand, like someone had pressed fingers flat to the outside and then leaned their cheek near the fabric. I told myself not to be dramatic. Lyle muttered, "If someone's coming, don't be a hero." He reached for his pocket knife and I thought about the stupidity of pocket knives. I zipped the small flap open a crack and stuck my head out. There was a figure, tall, hoodie up, standing just beyond the reach of the lamp. The face was a dark hole. The figure did not come forward. It simply stood there and watched us like one watches a fireplace patiently, uninterested in causing a ruckus. For reasons I can't explain rationally, my first thought was that it was lost. My second thought was that it was not lost at all. "How can I help you?" I called. My voice sounded thin and suburban in the wide night. No answer, only the distant cry of something, maybe a loon. Then the figure took 3 slow steps back and retreated into the trees without turning. The neighbor's tent remained dark. The campsite seemed to breathe inward and then out. We didn't sleep much after that. At dawn, light sharpened the world and reality asked for evidence. There were cigarette butts near the picnic table, one of them unbranded and cheap. There was a faint footprint in damp soil leading toward the tree line where the figure had gone. It looked like a boot, long and narrow. Nothing astounded us in the daylight, but the residue of the night felt wrong. We hiked the perimeter at noon and found the path where someone had been walking along the lake for a long stretch. Then we found something else. A small stack of twigs arranged like a mark, almost a small cairn. When I bent down, under the twigs I saw a scrap of fabric, thin, dark, and a smear of old mud that could have been a dried handprint. That afternoon, while packing for the second night, I noticed my tent zipper had been grazed. Not torn, but rubbed, as if a hand had dragged across it. We checked cameras and phones. Our neighbors, an elderly couple on the other side, claimed they hadn't seen anyone. Lal suggested calling the park ranger. The ranger came by and nodded, told us stories about hikers who like to hunt the dark, and left a radio frequency to call the next day if we felt threatened. But the sense of being watched gnawed at us like something under the skin. That night, we moved the tents closer to the road and left the truck light on. We drank too much and chatted loudly until late. The feeling was less intimidating with human noise as padding. At 1:57 a.m., the radio squawked and died. Someone on the channel said, "Report." Silence answered. Then, at 2:02 a.m., like punctuation, the figure was at the edge of our light. Not near the tent this time, but close enough to throw a shadow big as a man on the side of the truck. He had something in his hand, a lantern, I thought, but it looked like a bottle with a rag. He tapped the truck with the bottle 3 times. The sound skewed through my skull. We froze. Lyle, quietly furious, grabbed a flashlight and flicked it on full beam. For a second, the man was revealed: thin face, 2 long fingers, eyes that reflected the light in a weird milky way. He raised his hand as if in a salute, then turned and walked into the marshy edge of the lake like water took him in. The light swallowed him. We drove out that night. In the morning, when we went to check the site, there were 2 odd things. First, the grass at the water's edge had been trampled in a strange 50-yard arc as if something had paced. Second, on the underside of the tailgate of Lyle's truck, there was an old coin wedged in, real old, corroded and green with age. None of us recognized it. We left it behind when we left, like a puzzle with teeth we didn't want. After I went back to work the next week, Lyle sent a text. "Guy's been seen before. Old camp stories. Says test the tents sometimes. He's not aggressive. Just watches." I never wanted to test him. Months later, a friend on a local hiking forum posted a photo of the lake at night. Same trees, same path. In the reflection, if you look too long, you think you can see a second shore that isn't real. I still wake sometimes convinced I feel fingers on the canvas of my life. Light taps. The same rhythm, twice and once. I don't sleep with my truck unlocked anymore. When the woods don't want you there, they'll let you know. If you've ever camped on a cheap site in a state park, you probably know the way tents become small neighbors who know nothing of each other but share the same long sort of rulebook. We arrived late on a Friday in early August and claimed a flat patch of ground close enough to the ranger's cabin to feel like we had a guardian. The group was just 2 of us, then me and my girlfriend, Nina, looking for a cheap weekend away. We set the tent, built a modest fire, and drank warm beer. The city feels like fingers on your mind. The woods feel like a slow release. At around 11, they went quiet except for the sound of cicadas. Around midnight, Nina zipped up the tent. She has always been a little jumpy, and I liked the way she was careful about simple things. She's small and brave in ways that surprised me. I fell asleep to her even breathing. Sometime in the hour that lived between midnight and awakening, I felt like someone was in the room with me. It's a sensation your rational brain files under imagination, but the body keeps its own log. I rolled over and peered out of the vestibule. Through the thin fabric, I made out a slow, calculated movement. Steps. They weren't on the road. They were right there at the edge of the tent. A soft crunch of leaf and pine. They circled the tent. The first thing I did was keep very quiet and count. The pattern was 3 sets of steps, then a pause, then 3 sets slow and patient, like someone walking to the beat of a mechanical heart. The sound never came from the trees beyond the road. It stayed in the halo around our tent like a ring of listening. I whispered to Nina and she hummed in her sleep. I thought of waking her and letting her feel fear fuse into being. I didn't want to make her terrified. So, I lay still and listened, and the footsteps finished their circle and walked away. I told myself I'd made up the whole thing, that raccoons were clever and could emulate human tread if they'd taken a class. At dawn, we found shallow depressions pressed into the soil all around our tent. They weren't raccoon paw prints. They were 2 neat, longer, elongated with a peculiar flattened heel. We took pictures, and because the rational part of me likes to solve problems, I went to the ranger and asked whether there had been reports of people trying to spook campers. He shrugged and said, "Some folks walk the loop. Tell you an old story. They say the ground can keep the shape of a foot if someone walks that way at a certain time of year." That afternoon, the park hosted a small group for a nature talk, and it loosened the static in us. We laughed about the prints and attributed them to heavy boots and uneasy ground. That night, Emboldened by daylight, we left the tent with the flap open and a chair outside. The air was different at 2 a.m., a kind of chill that slides under the collar. The stars spilled, and we both felt far away and small and safe in the knowledge that the ranger's cabin still bobbed like a ship's light. Around 2:13 a.m., I heard soft padding. Not the three-set rhythm this time, but single, measured footfalls. They walked halfway around the tent and paused. When they paused, I heard the dry sound of cloth moving like someone shifting a tarp. I clicked the cheap LED on the table, and the beam struck a shape tall, thin, leaning on one leg just behind a sapling. It lifted its head. The face was wrong in the beam, too pale, too smooth, with a grin that didn't arrive all at once, but slanted, like a photograph developing. My hands did a clumsy thing and the light snapped off. In the sudden dark, I heard breathing slow and close to the ground. It sounded like someone sleeping next to a wood stove. My mind made the worst noises. I crawled quietly inside and zipped the tent. The zipper scraped like fingernails. Nina stirred and whispered, "Are you okay?" And I said yes, as if the word meant anything. We didn't sleep at all that night. We sat with our phones on and the flashlights pointed out like cones of protection. At some point, I saw an outline by the edge of the campsite. The figure didn't move away. It simply stood and watched until dawn eroded its shape. When the day came, I walked the path the figure must have taken. The prints were there again, circling, precise and deliberate. They led to a small pile of stones near the creek. On top of the stones, someone had left a small scrap of paper folded like an origami heart. Inside the fold was a hair, a thin, coiled strand like a mark someone left because they could. We packed up and left early. On the drive home, I realized I'd brought one of the stones from the pile in my pocket, an impulsive thing, like wanting proof that I wasn't insane. I put the stone on my nightstand for a while, and then, one night a month later, I woke to the sound of soft crunching on wet leaves outside my apartment window. I do not go camping alone anymore. And when I do go, I bring more than a flashlight. I bring a friend who does not think the dark is romantic. Not every circle is safe. I learned the whistling as a sign. I learned it because my friends laughed about it and said, "If you hear that whistling, pack up and go." It sounds silly when you read it, but when you're in the forest at night, a single tune can become a language. We had driven up to an old scout camp that friends of a friend had inherited for the weekend. The place was flanked by pines so tall they hid the sky. On the first night, as the fire died, we suspected raccoons because everything in the woods behaves like a creature at a buffet, careful and hopeful. At about 1:30 a.m., a thin, cheerful whistle started somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing. It was a two-note phrase, falling then rising, like a question mark turned into a greeting. Our group mocked it at first. "Someone's playing a flute," said Jenna, laughing. But when the whistling continued for an hour, alternating between close and far away, it became an architecture of sound that held us in its rooms. I remember the exact second the whistler switched to call and response. I cupped my hands around a mug and replied with a half-hearted whistle, the sort you make when you want to sound like you're in on a joke. The whistle answered back, long and slow this time, then paused and repeated the same phrase, only slightly off-key. It sounded delighted, like a dog who'd been taught to fetch. We thought it a prank until the next night when a friend, Tom, went out to pee and never really came back. He walked the edge of the camp complaining about how cold his feet were. 10 minutes later, he said he'd go for a walk. The whistle sang and then silence folded him in. When he didn't come back, two of us went out to look. We found his footprints. Then they stopped at a clump of ferns like someone had stepped neatly into a hole. The leaves around were undisturbed except for a small circle, as if he'd knelt. On the ground lay his flashlight, still smoldering but out, as if someone had pinched the battery. We searched until dawn. We called the ranger. Tom showed up that afternoon on our doorstep, soaked and smiling like he'd had a fine dream. He said he'd wandered into the old trail, heard a tune, and followed it. He shrugged off the worry from our faces. We were relieved and exhausted. That night, the whistle came again. Came with more insistence. We tried not to answer. One by one, our group drifted toward the edge of the trees, Tom among them, drawn like moths to a porch light. I stayed and watched the monarch of our misadventure go. He walked into the trees and came back 2 hours later carrying a strange object. A small carved wooden bird, delicate and too perfect for the hands that had made it. He placed it on the fire ring and said nothing for a long time, staring at the curls of smoke with something like affection and distance. On the 5th night, the whistle changed. It became layered like someone playing harmonies on a single reed. We stopped playing along and wrapped ourselves in sleeping bags like shells. The sound circled the camp and then softly, like a last thing before sleep, then it called. The same 2-note phrase but stretched long enough that we could hear the space between. The next morning, we discovered every tent had been touched. Not broken into, just opened and rearranged, slightly, zippers left halfway. Sleeping pads smoothed, a trail of leaves woven into patterns around the camp. On the path out, we found 3 small wooden birds nailed to tree trunks like watchmen, each carved in a different style. Each one had a small notch bitten out of its wing, as if someone had tested it with their teeth. Tom left after that day. He said the whistle had become too personal for him, a tune that carried names. He kept the wooden bird. I assume he sleeps with it. Some nights when the wind is right, I swear I can hear the 2-note phrase, faint and patient, asking like a neighbor checking if you remembered to bring a gift. Some sounds are invitations. We'd been friends since college, 4 of us who swore we'd never stop doing stupid things. We decided on a 3-day loop that a friend had recommended, remote and narrow and full of the kind of scenery that makes you post pictures you'll be embarrassed by later. We packed carefully, mostly to boast. The first day was a blur of uphill and bad music on a shared speaker. On the second night, our friend Carla didn't make dinner. At first, we thought she had woken early to read by the river. At dawn, we found her small backpack leaning by a tree with her sleeping bag folded inside it and a pair of boots tucked neatly beneath. Her phone was on the picnic table with a recording started on the voice memo app, a faint whispering that cut out mid-breath. We split into groups and scoured the trail. 2 of us took the river path, 2 took the ridge. We called her name until our throats hurt and our words turned hoarse. We found signs she had been there: broken twigs, a scrape on a log, the imprint of a sitting body by the river. Then nothing, like someone had stepped clean out of the scene. At midday, a pair of kayakers who'd passed us the previous morning came back up the river and told us they'd seen a woman walking the bank at dawn, waving, then stepping into the wood and simply disappearing. There were no prints after a certain line in the mud. The kayakers swore there had been no way to go around her without being seen from the river. We called search and rescue. They used dogs and grid lines and drones by the second day. The drone footage picked up a blur near a steep bank, but the math of the images made no sense. Height and angle suggested maybe a shallow hollow where someone could hide. Nights blurred. We slept in shifts, haunted by the idea that the trail itself could lead you somewhere and then cause you to be forgotten. On the 3rd morning, a local reported seeing someone matching Carla's jacket near an old ranger's shack on the far side of the loop. We rushed and found a trail leading to a small clearing where someone had dragged a tarp and built a crude shelter out of branches. There were charred embers and an old soda can. Scattered around were things that belonged to all of us. A bead from my girlfriend's bracelet, a tear of someone's map, a hair clip, but still no Carla. The most unsettling thing was a note pinned under a stone at the center of the shelter. It said simply, "She went inside." There was no signature. We tore the shelter apart like we were ripping at the idea that someone else had arranged our world. Nothing inside suggested foul play in the sense you imagine: no blood, no violent signs. But there were traces, small and domestic, like someone had been staying there quietly, moving between our camp and the shelter in ways that suggested a familiarity with our habits. Carla never came back. The park kept the search on for a week. We dismantled that campsite ourselves after the authorities scaled back. That sentence, "She went inside," is the one that knifes me at night. Inside where? Inside a hollow, inside a cavity, inside someone else's plan. You learn to listen to your boots when the trail turns, because that's where the world can decide whether to keep one of you. When a trail bites, it doesn't always let go. We've all heard the cliche about water reflecting more than the sky. I thought it was a line until the night that made me question what a reflection could be. We'd gone back to that same cheap site by the lake because we liked how close it was to a decent grocery store, and because sometimes comfort is better than adventure. The second night, After the beer and quiet, I went alone to the water to watch the stars. The world felt like an image, crisp and sterile, and I liked the way it put distance between me and work. Halfway down the sloped bank, I set a small lantern and sat, the kind that glows like an ember. The lake was black glass. My reflection floated like a second person, eyes half closed. I had my knees under my chin and watched the long, slow breath of the water. After a while, I noticed another light across the lake. It wasn't a headlamp. It was low, like a candle, and it moved slowly along the far shore. The movement was methodical, like someone pacing. I tried to tell myself it was another campsite, a lone fisherman maybe, but there was no boat on the water and the light's path didn't match any trail on the map. I left my lantern and walked to the tree-line to get a better look. The light moved away from the path as if someone was walking the thin margin between water and woodland. Then, with a calm absurdity, it stopped. A figure stood in place and lifted a hand to the sky as if to measure distance. The lake's surface accepted the light and made a perfect twin 2 points of warmth on the black glass. I walked back to the lantern because something in the image of the two lights made my spine combust with unreason. When I looked down at the lantern, my reflection in the water moved, but not in sync. My head in the glass tilted a fraction too late. It was a tiny desync, something a camera might do in cheap frame drops, but because it was me, because I was watching my own mirrored self, the glitch made the night shape into a thing with intent. I leaned forward. My reflection leaned back. The hairs on my arms drew a map. Then the sound started. Not footsteps on grass this time, but the soft scraping of something long and gentle along the water, a series of wet noises like someone tracing a finger across a bottle. I stood and saw the figure on the far shore take a small step into the water, and the lantern's candlelight blink like a human eye. The reflected figure on the lake did not step. It rose from the water as if from under the skin. I don't know why I did what I did next. I walked into the lake to the point where water kissed knee and then hip. I watched the reflection of the lamp and the shadow, and then it bent its head and looked right at me. Not into me, but through the top layer of me, as if it was reading the things I hadn't read. The figure stopped. For a moment there was a mutual inspection, two beings in mirrored worlds judging each other for trespass. The light on the shore winked out. The water took the mirrored light into a smear, and then the surface smoothed and became a mirror again as if nothing had happened. I stumbled back and fell on the bank with a foolish, dog-like whimper. The lantern I thought I left burning was in my hand. There were no prints, no stones left on the shore where the light had been. Only a ring of flattened rushes, as if someone had pushed through to steal a moment. We left at dawn silently. None of us spoke while packing. I kept my head down and thought of reflections and the small ways our worlds betray us. At home, I took to staring into windows and trying to catch myself in a still moment. I worry sometimes that there's a place where reflections make different choices, and sometimes those choices look back. These were 5 camping trips that went wrong in ways small and large. If you've got a night you still think about, email it to scaredalessamond@gmail.com. Keep it neat and true style, we might read it. Please subscribe for more true scary stories. Good night.